The sanctuary of the Potter's House buzzed with the familiar energy of Sunday evening service. Thousands of congregants filled the pews, their voices rising in unified worship, hands lifted toward heaven. But in the back corner of the massive auditorium, 24-year-old Marcus Thompson sat with his head slightly bowed, fighting a battle no one could see. Marcus had perfected the art of hiding. Behind his carefully composed expression lay months of accumulated pain. The weight of a failed business venture that had drained his savings, the sting of a broken engagement, and the crushing loneliness that followed losing his job 3 weeks ago. He'd come to church tonight not out of habit but out of desperation. The mask he wore daily was beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it together. As Bishop T.D. Jakes took the stage, his commanding presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. There was something about the way Pastor Jakes carried himself, a mixture of authority and tenderness that made people feel both challenged and comforted. Tonight, he wore his signature dark suit, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes scanning the congregation with the intensity of someone who truly saw people, not just faces in a crowd. "Church," Pastor Jakes began, his rich baritone voice carrying across the sanctuary. "Tonight I want to talk to those of you who are tired. I'm talking to those who smile during the day, but cry at night. Those who answer, 'I'm fine,' when asked how they're doing, but your heart is screaming something entirely different." Marcus felt his chest tighten. It was as if the pastor was speaking directly to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, crossing his arms as a defensive barrier. But even as he tried to maintain his composure, tears began to well up in his eyes. Tears he had been holding back for weeks. If you've ever felt like you're carrying burdens that no one else can see, you're not alone in this journey. Sometimes God uses our lowest moments to prepare us for our greatest breakthroughs, and tonight's message might be exactly what your heart needs to hear. "I see you," Pastor Jakes continued, now pacing slowly across the stage. "You're here because something inside you knows that God hasn't given up on you, even when you've given up on yourself. You're here because your spirit recognizes that there's still hope, even when your mind tells you otherwise." Marcus tried to wipe his eyes discreetly, but the tears were coming faster now. He looked around nervously, hoping no one would notice his emotional state. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. He had built his entire identity around being strong, reliable, the one others could count on. Showing vulnerability felt like admitting defeat, but Pastor Jakes wasn't finished. His voice grew more tender, more personal. "There's someone here tonight who's been carrying a load that wasn't meant for one person to bear. You've been trying to fix everything on your own, believing that asking for help is a sign of weakness. But son, daughter, carrying that weight alone isn't strength. It's pride dressed up as independence." Those words hit Marcus like a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. He had indeed been trying to handle everything alone. After his business failed, he'd refused help from family members who offered. When his fiancée left, he'd declined friends' invitations to talk. When he lost his job, he'd spent nights applying for positions rather than reaching out to his network. He'd convinced himself that real men solved their own problems, that faith meant never showing doubt or struggle. As the pastor continued speaking about God's heart for the burdened and broken, Marcus found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. For the first time in months, he felt something stirring inside him. Not just emotion, but a flicker of hope he thought had died. The weight on his shoulders suddenly felt less crushing, as if someone else was helping him carry it. Pastor Jakes' voice rose with passionate conviction. "God is looking for broken vessels tonight. He's looking for people who've tried everything in their own strength and discovered that their strength wasn't enough. Because when you come to the end of yourself, that's where you find the beginning of God's power in your life." Marcus closed his eyes and let those words wash over him. For months he'd been afraid of admitting weakness, terrified of acknowledging that he couldn't handle life on his own. But sitting in that sanctuary, surrounded by the voices of other believers and the anointed words of Pastor Jakes, he began to understand that surrender might not be defeat. It might be the doorway to victory. During the altar call that followed Pastor Jakes' message, Marcus remained seated, gripping the edge of the pew. Part of him wanted to respond, to walk down that aisle and surrender the crushing weight he'd been carrying. But another part, the part that had learned early in life that vulnerability was dangerous, kept him planted in his seat. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Marcus, a man handles his own problems. He doesn't burden others with his struggles. As the service concluded and people began filing out, Marcus took his time gathering his things. He wasn't ready to face the outside world yet, wasn't prepared to put his mask back on for the drive home to his empty apartment. The worship had stirred something deep within him, but he wasn't sure what to do with those feelings. That's when he noticed Pastor Jakes making his way through the thinning crowd, stopping to speak with various congregation members. Marcus watched from a distance, observing how the pastor gave each person his full attention, how he seemed to genuinely care about their responses to his questions about their lives and struggles. There was no rush in his movements, no sense that he was checking boxes or fulfilling obligations. Each conversation appeared to matter to him. Marcus was so focused on watching these interactions that he didn't notice when Pastor Jakes began walking in his direction. It wasn't until he heard that familiar, warm voice saying, "Good evening, son," that Marcus looked up to find the pastor standing directly in front of him, his kind eyes studying Marcus's face with gentle intensity. "Evening, Pastor," Marcus managed, his voice slightly hoarse from the emotion he'd been suppressing all evening. He started to stand, but Pastor Jakes gestured for him to remain seated. Pastor Jakes studied Marcus's face with the practiced eye of someone who had counseled thousands of hurting souls. He could see past the attempted smile, past the straightened shoulders, past the carefully composed exterior. What he saw was a young man drowning in his own pride and pain, fighting to keep his head above water but slowly losing the battle. "What's your name?" Pastor Jakes asked, settling into the pew beside Marcus despite the fact that dozens of other people were waiting to speak with him. His decision to sit sent a clear message. This conversation mattered. This person mattered. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, surprised by the pastor's unhurried manner and genuine interest. "Marcus," Pastor Jakes repeated thoughtfully, letting the name roll off his tongue. "That's a strong name. Named after Marcus Aurelius, perhaps, the Roman emperor who wrote about the struggles of leadership and the importance of inner strength during difficult times." This unexpected connection caught Marcus completely off guard. Most people didn't recognize the historical significance of his name, and hearing Pastor Jakes make that connection felt deeply personal. "Actually, yes, my grandfather chose the name. He always said I was meant for something significant, that I had the heart of a leader." Pastor Jakes nodded slowly, his expression growing more thoughtful. "Grandfathers have a way of seeing things in us that we sometimes can't see in ourselves, especially during seasons when life has beaten us down. Tell me, Marcus, what would your grandfather say if he could see you right now, in this moment?" Sometimes God places people in our path at exactly the moment we need them most, and Pastor Jakes had a supernatural gift for recognizing when someone needed more than just a greeting or surface-level encouragement. He could sense the deep wounds that Marcus was trying so hard to hide. The question pierced through Marcus's defenses like a sword through paper. His grandfather had been his hero, the man who taught him about faith, about perseverance, about what it meant to be a man of God. If his grandfather could see him now, defeated, isolated, struggling with doubt and financial ruin, what would he think? Would he be disappointed? Would he regret the confidence he'd placed in his grandson? "He'd probably tell me to stop trying to carry the world on my shoulders," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He used to say that even Atlas needed help sometimes, and that the strongest men were those who knew when to ask for it. "Wise man," Pastor Jakes replied with genuine admiration, and he'd be absolutely right. "You know, Marcus, I've been in ministry for over 40 years, and I've learned something important. The strongest people aren't those who never fall down. The strongest people are those who know how to fall down gracefully and get back up with help from others and from God." Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of Pastor Jakes' gentle but persistent love. But what if you fall so hard that you're not sure you can get back up? What if everything you touch seems to turn to dust, and you start wondering if God has forgotten your name? Pastor Jakes leaned back slightly, his eyes filled with understanding rather than judgment, compassion rather than condemnation. This wasn't the first time he'd heard these words, these fears, these doubts. "Then you're in the perfect position to discover what grace really means, son. See, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. And right now, in this very moment, you're being called to something greater than your current circumstances." "I don't feel called to anything," Marcus said, finally allowing some of his real emotions to surface, his voice cracking slightly. "I feel forgotten. Like God started something in my life and then just walked away when things got difficult. like I was some kind of experiment that didn't work out. The pastor's expression grew even more tender, and he leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between them as a way of closing the emotional distance as well. Marcus, can I share something with you? Some of the most powerful testimonies I've ever heard came from people who felt exactly like you do right now. People who thought God had forgotten them, only to discover he was actually preparing them for something they never could have imagined in their wildest dreams. Pastor Jakes glanced at his watch and then back at Marcus, making a decision that would change the trajectory of this young man's life. Son, I know you probably need to get home, but would you be willing to walk with me to my office? I have a feeling this conversation is just getting started, and some things are better discussed in private, away from distractions. Marcus hesitated for a moment, part of him wanting to retreat to the safety of his isolation, but something in the pastor's manner, genuine concern mixed with patient strength, made him nod in agreement. They walked through the now empty corridors of the church, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space, each step taking Marcus further from his old patterns of hiding, and closer to a breakthrough he didn't yet recognize. Pastor Jakes' office was warm and inviting, filled with books, family photos, and various awards and recognitions from his decades of ministry. But what struck Marcus most was how normal it felt, how unintimidating. This was clearly the workspace of someone who was more interested in connecting with people than impressing them, more focused on healing hearts than displaying achievements. Have a seat wherever you're comfortable, Pastor Jakes said, settling behind his desk but maintaining an open, approachable posture. Now, Marcus, I want you to know that whatever we discuss here stays here. This is a safe space, and I've found that healing begins when we stop pretending we have it all together and start being honest about where we really are. The permission to be vulnerable, spoken so clearly and without judgment, was exactly what Marcus needed to hear. The floodgates finally opened, and words began pouring out of him like water from a broken dam, carrying with them months of accumulated pain, frustration, and disappointment. He told Pastor Jakes about the business he'd started with such high hopes, how he'd invested everything, not just money, but his dreams, his identity, his sense of purpose. He described the humiliation of watching it fail despite his best efforts, the sleepless nights wondering where he'd gone wrong, the phone calls from creditors that made him feel like a failure as a man and as a believer. When the Lord allows us to reach our breaking point, it's often because he knows that's where our breakthrough begins. Marcus was about to discover that his lowest moment was actually the foundation for his greatest victory. But first, he had to be willing to be completely honest about his pain. He spoke about Sarah, his ex-fiancée, and how she'd left when the financial pressure became too much. She said she loved me, but that she couldn't handle the stress of uncertainty. Said she needed someone who could provide stability, someone who had their life together. The worst part was that I couldn't even argue with her. I felt like I was failing at everything. And losing your job? Pastor Jakes prompted gently when Marcus paused, his voice filled with compassion rather than curiosity. That was the final straw, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. I'd already lost my business, lost the woman I thought I'd marry, and then I lost the one thing that was keeping me afloat financially. I started questioning everything, my faith, my worth, whether God even cared about what happened to me. I began wondering if I'd misheard his voice completely. Pastor Jakes listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making a small sound of understanding. When Marcus finally finished, emotionally drained but somehow feeling lighter, the room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus, Pastor Jakes said finally, his voice filled with authority and love, thank you for trusting me with your story. I want you to know that what you've just shared isn't the story of a failure. It's the story of someone being prepared for promotion. Every setback, every disappointment, every moment of doubt has been part of God's process of preparing you for something greater. Marcus looked up, confusion and hope warring in his eyes. How can you possibly say that? I've lost everything that mattered to me. I'm starting over from nothing. No, son, Pastor Jakes replied firmly but kindly, standing up and walking around his desk to sit directly across from Marcus. You've lost some things, but you haven't lost everything. You still have your faith, wounded though it may be. You still have your character, tested though it has been. You still have your purpose, hidden though it currently appears. And most importantly, You still have the calling your grandfather saw in you all those years ago. Pastor Jakes reached for a well-worn Bible on his desk and opened it to a passage he had clearly turned to many times before, the pages soft and familiar under his fingers. Marcus, I want to read you something from Isaiah 43:18-19. Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. He looked up from the Bible and made direct eye contact with Marcus, his gaze intense but warm. God is telling you to forget the former things, not to pretend they didn't happen, but to stop letting them define your future. He's doing a new thing in your life, Marcus. The question is, are you willing to perceive it? Are you ready to see beyond your current circumstances? Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like rusty gears finally beginning to turn again after months of being stuck. What does that look like practically? I mean, I still need a job. I still have bills to pay. I still need to figure out what comes next. Faith is important, but it doesn't pay rent. Absolutely, Pastor Jakes agreed with a knowing smile. Faith without action is dead, and hope without a plan is just wishful thinking. But here's what I want you to understand. Your next season isn't going to look like your last season. The experiences you've had, the failure, the rejection, the financial struggle, those weren't detours from your destiny. They were preparation for it. Pastor Jakes stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a small leather journal that had obviously been waiting for the right moment, the right person. I want to give you something, he said, handing the bound book to Marcus. This is a prayer journal. I want you to start writing down your prayers, your thoughts, your dreams. But I also want you to start documenting the small victories, the unexpected blessings, the moments when you see God's hand moving in your life. Marcus accepted the journal, running his fingers over the smooth leather cover, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Thank you, Pastor. But I have to ask, why are you investing this much time in me? You don't even know me. There are probably hundreds of people who need your attention more than I do. The question brought a knowing smile to Pastor Jakes' face. The smile of someone who understood exactly how God works through seemingly chance encounters. Marcus, 30 years ago, I was sitting in an office much like this one, across from a pastor who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. I was broken, discouraged, and ready to give up on the calling God had placed on my life. That pastor didn't just preach to me. He invested in me. He saw my potential when all I could see was my pain. As we near the end of this journey together, remember that every ending is actually a new beginning in disguise. Marcus's story was about to take a turn that would surprise even him, because God's plans are always bigger than our problems and His purposes always prevail. That pastor's investment in me changed the trajectory of my entire life. Pastor Jakes continued, his voice filled with gratitude for a man who had believed in him decades earlier. Everything I've been able to accomplish, every life I've been privileged to touch, every message I've been able to preach, it all traces back to someone who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Now it's my turn to pass that forward, and you're the next link in that chain. Marcus felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude and dawning hope. Tears that came from finally understanding that he wasn't alone in his struggle. What do you see in me, Pastor? What do you see that I can't see? Pastor Jakes leaned forward, his voice taking on the authority of someone speaking prophetically, guided by divine insight. I see a man who's been through the fire and came out refined rather than consumed. I see someone who's learned empathy through his own suffering, who can now speak to others' pain from a place of authentic understanding. I see a leader in the making, not the kind who's never fallen, but the kind who knows how to help others get back up. Pastor Jakes pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back before handing it to Marcus. I want you to call this number tomorrow morning. It's a friend of mine who runs a non-profit organization that helps people rebuild after financial setbacks. They're looking for someone to lead their mentorship program, someone who understands both the practical and emotional challenges of starting over. Marcus stared at the card in disbelief, reading the name and number written in Pastor Jakes' careful handwriting. You're offering me a job? Just like that, I'm offering you an opportunity to turn your pain into someone else's breakthrough. This position won't make you rich financially, but I have a feeling it will make you rich in purpose. And sometimes, that's exactly what our souls need to begin healing, to know that our struggles weren't wasted, that they can be used to help others. As they prepared to leave the office, Pastor Jakes placed a firm but gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, the gesture of a spiritual father to a son who was just beginning to understand his worth. Marcus, I want you to remember something. This conversation tonight wasn't an accident. God saw your tears before you shed them. He heard your prayers before you prayed them, and he had this meeting arranged before you even knew you needed it. Marcus nodded, feeling lighter than he had in months, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As they walked toward the exit, he realized that he was walking differently, not with the burdened posture of defeat, but with the cautious but growing confidence of someone who had just been reminded of his worth and potential. As Marcus drove home that night, the city lights looked different somehow, brighter, more hopeful. The same apartment that had felt like a prison of loneliness now felt like a temporary way station on the road to something better. For the first time in months, Marcus Thompson was excited to see what tomorrow might bring.